presentation today. So just a very quick update from me. I'm Sarah McKenney, Director of Alumni Relations here at NSU, and working the Zoom with me is Emily Lopez Martin, who's my Assistant Director, and Renee Johnson is here also as my Associate Director. So we're really excited to be here with all of you, and thank you for participating in our Lunch and Learn series. We're coming up on a month of this, I'm sorry, a year of this series in March. So we're grateful for all of you who are here with us and joining us via your lunch hour. Very quickly wanted to say thanks for that and a reminder that we have these monthly. So the next one's coming up in March. Stay tuned for that. But I'll hand the mic off now as we partner with this one with Danielle DeRoss, who is our communications manager. So Danielle, take it away.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for spending your lunch break with us. I think this is going to be a very educational and engaging conversation, and I'm so excited to be able to help host it. I want to start off by saying that Florida's coral reefs are one of our most valuable natural resources. After all, they support marine life, they protect our coastlines, and they sustain the blue economy, but they're also under severe stress. And perhaps you have seen those news headlines, or perhaps you've even seen the evidence for yourself, how marine heat waves have triggered unprecedented bleaching events, and how once dominant reef building species like elkhorn and staghorn corals are now functionally extinct across much of Florida's reef system. Simply put, our corals are in trouble, and restoring them is no longer optional, it is essential. And that's why we're fortunate today to hear from somebody who is working on the front lines of that effort. Brian Walker is a research program director at Nova Southeastern University, and he works at the National Coral Reef Institute. He's also a proud NSU alum, and his work focuses on coral disease intervention and understanding how inland water quality issues are impacting our coastal reef systems. So please join me in welcoming Brian Walker. And as you listen to his talk, please feel free to add your questions into the chat. We're looking forward to having an engaging conversation with him. So, Dr. Walker, please begin.
Thanks, Danielle. I appreciate that. Can you hear me okay? All right, let me see if I can share my screen. It's always kind of strange presenting to a black box, but I do see a lot of familiar names in the presentation or in the show, so that's really cool. Hopefully you will see my slideshow.
Yes.
How's that?
Looks great.
Awesome. Well, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. It's always nice to be able to show what we're doing, especially a new audience like this. The NSU alumni folks are great. I'm one of them, and it's always nice to reconnect. As Danielle had mentioned, today's talk's focused on Florida's coral reef and the need for water quality improvement. And hopefully, I've removed too much of the technical aspects so that you can get the gist of what we're doing without too much, without knowing too much background. But if not, please put in questions in the chat. So I would like to start off by just showing a map. This is the earliest known map of Florida Keys. This was drawn by Louis Agassiz in 1880. And so even way back then, the Keys were recognized as a very special area. Obviously, back then, a lot of it had to do with ship groundings, because if vessels were coming across, they didn't know where they were going to run aground on the reef. But also, Louis Agassiz described many of the different incredible biological aspects of the reef system as well. And you'll notice at this point, a lot of the keys that are named for the reef trek were existed back then in the 1800s. So most of us recognize the Florida's reef for its beautiful value. I mean, there's aesthetic value. It's lots of thriving nature, and of course, it has a lot of other value as well to ecosystem services. But here's just some examples of the things you might think of when you go to the Keys: beautiful turtles and large fish, um, large corals, big reef structures, stuff like that. Um, Florida's coral reef has a rich biodiversity. Nearly 25% of marine species exist on coral reefs globally, and that is the case here as well. The Reefs tract holds a ton of diversity. They thrive in oligotrophic waters, which means waters with low nutrients, so open ocean type water. And they provide vital ecosystem services like coastal protection, tourism, and sustenance. But a fact that a lot of people may not know is that traditionally, when you think of the Florida Reef, Florida's coral reef, you think of the Florida Keys and the dry tortugas in the south, because that's really what most people flock to when they come down here to do tourism and see the reefs. However, a third of the reef tract goes northward from Key Biscayne all the way up to Martin County. In that part of the reef, it was less well known until we started mapping it in the early 2000s using LiDAR technologies. That area has just now been renamed the Kristen Jacobs Coral Aquatic Preserve, and they are putting out a management plan very soon. It's in draft form right now, and I believe they're still accepting comments on it if you're interested in checking it out. But my point is most of my work focuses on this region because it's much more dynamic of a system. As the reef tract heads northerly, it runs from a tropical system in the south to a temperate system in the north. So the waters get cooler, and there's a lot of interesting changes in the biology and the constituents on the reefs as you move forward northward. So, like I mentioned, back in the early 2000s, we mapped the reefscape. We're flying above the reef from Key Biscayne going north. We just passed Miami. The colors on the seafloor represent habitat types, so different places where different organisms live. And then there's also, you can see sand pits where they dug sand to renourish beaches. You can kind of see the reef features and the various inlets that we pass as we go north. But you'll notice that the colors change and drop off, especially when we get into Palm Beach County. We really only have one distinct reef line, and that reef line ends as you get close to Lake Worth Inlet. That reef then gives way to a bunch of hard ground, and the system really changes at that point. So it's an example of how this system changes as you go northward away from the tropics. As part of that, we've mapped quite a bit of dense staghorn corals and some several hundred large corals that weren't expected, that were unexpected to be here. But you can see on the left these dense staghorn patches that we have. This is off of Broward County. They don't look like this anymore. This was taken a number of years ago. But this is what these are like exceptional sites that we have in the area. And you can see this large coral and all the fishes and other things associated with it. We know of several hundred of these that we are keeping alive using disease interventions. So I think the main point here is just to let you know that the coral animal is the backbone of the reef. The reef is created by these animals. They are basically upside down jellyfish that live all interconnected together, and they secrete a calcium carbonate skeleton. And that over time, that builds up into rocks. And then as they die and settle on old rocks and settle on each other and keep building up and up and up, they form these big structures that you can see from space or from that flyover that I just showed. And they build these living aquatic cities. They host a ton of other marine life, and they're really the foundational species for building the structure that all these other things can then um, live and support. So they're very important. But in terms of understanding, how important they are to humans, there's also a lot of economic studies that have been done, and there's a lot of value to humans. Now, this shows value from all the natural ecosystems in a coral reef ecosystem like mangroves and oysters. But just coral reefs alone can reduce 97% of the wave energy and act as a barrier from storms. And which is a first line of defense for about 63 million people globally. But even in South Florida, as the map shows on the right, um, the green color would be if we had a flooding event with restored reefs versus the red color, which would be a flooding event during our current reef situation. So say a hurricane's coming in and we're getting a big storm surge, if we have restored reefs, we will flood less homes and communities than we will if those reefs are in their current condition or if they get worse. So it's really important that we understand this and that we move towards preserving them and their value. This is a kind of a series of the reef, one particular location in the Keys over many decades. Gene Shin at USGS compiled a bunch of these because he grew up down there and he's dedicated his life to working in the Keys on coral reefs. But these are classic examples of how the reefscape has changed over the years. So in the 70s, we had this lush, staghorn, elkhorn coral growing near the surface, and everything was live coral. When we get into the 80s, we see a degradation of those species, but we still have a lot of other boulder species that were still around. And then as we go into the 90s and then the 2000s, you can see how the system has changed. And the things that are growing on the rocks are now gorgonians, which are a soft coral, and they don't really build structure. They provide structure at the time they're alive, but they don't build structure over time. And so eventually, without the live coral, the reef will erode. Here's an example of reef erosion. The picture on the right or on the left is a live staghorn patch, one that I filmed off of Fort Lauderdale by the Sea. This was, several years ago now. And then one on the right is one that used to look like the one on the left, but died some time ago. And now just the bones remain, just the structure remains. And as new hurricane storms and other things come through, that structure will degrade and then become rubble habitat. And that rubble habitat continuously moves and it doesn't allow new corals and new things to really grow on it. So it's really important that we keep these things alive and healthy to provide that habitat. So what's going on with the reefs? Well, really, there's two main stressors that I'm going to talk about today. One is a global stressor, which is much more difficult for us to deal with as individuals. And then we have local stressors. So the real global stressor here is sea surface temperature or due to climate change. Over the years, you can see this black jaggy line going from 1985. These are global sea surface temperature values over time. And you see they go up and down throughout the years, but they continue on and then eventually start going up, up, and up. And so the purple is actually the times that are associated with these global bleaching events where, a large portion of coral throughout the world bleached due to temperatures. And so you can see now, even our lower temperatures are below the means, the previous means, or our lowest temperatures are above the previous high temperatures. If we look at it a different way, here's a compilation of the number of degree heating weeks, which is the time corals spend at a high stressful temperature. And if we look at those through time, we can see these peaks as the main global bleaching events. But the one thing that really stands out here is that the magnitude of these global bleaching events is getting much stronger, right? It was previously in 98, there was about 20% of the bleaching of reefs bleached, whereas in 2025, we had near 80% of the reefs bleached. But also the frequency at which these events occur is getting more frequent. So they're occurring more often. We had a long time between the 98 and the 2010-11 bleaching, but then a much shorter time. And now we're not even sure if the heating has stopped yet or if our fourth global bleaching event is still going on. So nothing more exemplary than this graph that shows water temperature in the Keys during 2023. The black line is the water temperature measured by satellite imagery, sea surface temperature, and you can see that it was one of the strongest years at that time. 24 and 25 have been equally as strong, or a little bit more, actually. And so the heating event that we're in now is really unprecedented. And what came of that was a lot of bleaching, especially the acroporids, the staghorn coral, and the elkhorn coral. If these are time series at sites, you look from left to right, you'll see healthy coral on the left, bleached coral in the middle, and then on the right is the result, which is a lot of dead coral. And just visually, you can see that these systems change. And this is just over a matter of several months in 2023. And this is why they're calling for, the alarm on the sounding the alarm on this species in particular, that it may be ecologically extinct. But here's a result of a lot of the mortality, and there's a spatial gradation in the mortality. So in the southern Keys and the dry Tortugas, there were nearly 100% mortality of these particular corals, where they died completely. And then as you go up the reef tracts, you're getting more and more away from that tropical zone. Less of the corals fully died. They may have bleached, but they then recovered. But still, almost 50%, even in Broward and Miami-Dade. So alarming, but that kind of points to a question of, well, if the Keys are going to be really, really hot, what about our area up here in Southeast Florida? Is it an area that could sustain coral reefs through these warmer periods? And to answer that question, we have to then start looking into our region to see what the stressors are. And unfortunately, as you get further up closer to us, the development is just so much more impactful, and there's just so much more use of the reefs. And this is just a great illustration to show all the influences that we have on our reefscape. And so how do we manage these in a way that would allow corals to recruit in and start growing and thriving here, to get away from the heat further south? Well, as part of this, this was a career-changing event for myself, but in 2014, we had an unprecedented disease and bleaching event. This was a disease, well, the bleaching event was part of one of the global bleaching event. I think it was the third one. And then the disease was um, a new disease and called labeled stony coral tissue loss disease. And that disease originated somewhere in Miami-Dade, northern Miami-Dade County, and spread out both north and south along the reef tract over a number of years to eventually consume the whole reef tract, and has gone on to spread in other parts of the Caribbean. And the result is it's killed millions of corals in Florida as well as other areas. Now, the illustration shows it is all red, but that doesn't mean everything's dead in there. That's just showing the spread of the disease. But the impacts were great, and it changed the coral population demographics in major ways. So one response to that was to start treating the corals that have disease with a antibacterial paste that would at least stop the disease from killing the coral completely. And that's part of the work I'll show you today. But the most likely source of the disease, a lot of work has been done through different papers to try and figure out where this disease came from. And a lot of the sources point to Port Miami, Government Cut in particular, which is the inlet you see on the left. And at that time, Port Miami was doing a massive dredging event and over several years. And combined with the global bleaching temperatures, they think something happened where the sediment coming out of the dredging was carrying some stuff that traveled along the reefs. But anyway, they've recently done some hydrographic modeling to determine where those sediment plumes went, and they tend to match the patterns that that disease reports matched. So it seems pretty likely that this had something to do with this initial spread of the disease. So what that means to us is that, well, geez, if we're going to, if the keys are too hot, they need, corals can survive up here. We need to clean up our water, and we need to understand what's happening with these inland water connections, because corals do not thrive in polluted waters and waters with high nutrients. And so our job was to try and undertake this venture to find out what those connections are. The threats from runoff to coral reefs are plentiful throughout the world, but in Florida we have some really key ones, which are old septic systems. A lot of the older cities in Florida, especially near the coastline, are still on septic tanks, and as sea level rises, those septic tanks are failing and not functioning properly. We also have a lot of agriculture, especially in South Miami-Dade. And of course, we have tons of storm runoff and a heavily managed waterway system. And those types of things can cause disease, disrupt ecological functions, and change the reefs and inhibit their growth and reproduction. So a lot of this stems back from early, I guess, late 1800s, when the Everglades flow was changed from its original flow on the left to more the current day flow on the right. This was done to get rid of the water to create land for farming and for development. But ultimately what it did was it changed the ecology of the entire region, including the way water flows onto the coral reefs. And so instead of laminar flow from Lake Okeechobee down to Florida Bay, where the water was able to be filtered out by the living organisms before it got there, now it's been channelized and it's shot straight through our most populated areas, where it picks up lots of runoff from roads and streets and other things before it heads out to the reefs. So to investigate this and the effects it's having on the reefs, we turn to some water quality uh, data that's been collected by DEP over the last, well, since 2018. DEP has had a number of stations, water quality stations offshore that they collect monthly water data from and have it analyzed for certain key nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, to understand, what's changing in the water chemistry, what the state of the water chemistry is on the reefs themselves. Um, but those data are very hard to interpret unless you understand or have the ability to account for all the factors that go into that given sample at that given period in time. And so what we did was we were able to get data from the South Florida Water Management District to look at inlet flow and rainfall and wind speed from NOAA data to understand how these environmental factors might be playing a role in affecting the water quality on the reefs. So each inlet, we did this at 4 main inlets, Government Cut in Miami, Baker's Hollover, Port Everglades, and Hillsborough Inlet. And each one of these inlets has a portion of land associated with the water that drains to that inlet. And those are colored in the map on the right. And so you can see those different colorations all are associated with those different inlets. So we took the flow data and the water data from each of those regions and we associated it to each of those inlets. And then we looked at historically back in time when a water quality sample was collected, what was the history of inlet flow and rainfall and wind over the last 1 day, 3 days, 7 days, 14 days, 30 days, and so on, and then look for associations to those values in statistical models. So this is the worst part of the stats that I'm going to present, hopefully. But all this is to say that we found pretty high relationships with the water quality and the predictors, the environmental factors of inland rain and flow to at the water quality site. So in some cases, up to near 80% of the variation of water quality nutrient was explained by these factors. If we look at the various nutrients, nitrate, nitrite, orthophosphate, and we can break down the contributions of the things that contributed to that variation, we see that year is a strong predictor in most cases, right? So that means that these nutrients are changing by the year pretty strongly. But we also see associations with both flow metrics, either 7 days or 30 days prior, and rain metrics, 30 days, 7 days prior. So both those, those when it's raining at those rain gauges way inland, or those flow stations are flowing, we're seeing this really high relationship to water quality on the reef itself. If we go into some of these, we can start to understand the patterns behind them. These are figures just showing the individual nutrient that's listed while holding everything else in the model kind of consistent so that you can look at what's happening with these individual nutrients. And so if you increase flow, in a lot of cases, as flow gets higher and higher, you get more and more nutrients on the reefs. But that only goes up to a point. And once flow is beyond that point, more flow doesn't necessarily mean you'll get more nutrients. Similarly, with rainfall, we see some same patterns where we have this, as it rains, we get this initial pulse of nutrients, and that we think that's from the runoff, rain washing into the drains and then the canals and then being pushed out. But then ultimately, more and more rain isn't going to really provide more because then it gets diluted out. Um, so looking at the year factor, and this is one of the most explanatory variables in the models, it's a little concerning because it's not only that they're changing every year, but that they're increasing. Most of these nutrients are have been increasing the entire data set, the entire 5-year period that we've analyzed them. And so what that means is, something needs to be done very quickly if we want to be able to save the reef system out there. What could explain that increase? Well, we have just something that came to my mind. It was just our high population, and that increases in population would perhaps increase all those pollutants that might be coming out onto the reefs. If we look at the net population change in both Miami-Dade and Broward County over the last 15 years or so, we can see that we've been adding 30, 40,000 people for the last several decades, except for in and around COVID, where we actually lost some people. But the last 3 years, or 22 through 2024, if you add up all those for both counties, you're looking at about 270,000 new residents just in that period of time. So in my mind, I'm thinking that many more residents, it sure would explain heavier loads on the system. For us, we wanted to take this to the next step and understand how the water quality was linked to actual coral condition. So we've been monitoring 107 of these largest corals in our region since 2018. And every time we visit these corals, we take pictures of them, we take data on them, and if they have any disease, we treat them with this antibiotic paste. That antibiotic paste is about 80% successful, 85% successful. And we go back, because we're going back monthly, we can keep these corals alive for much longer than they would be if they weren't visited at all. And that allows us to accumulate data on the amount of times they're getting diseased and how that relates to their location and time throughout the year. If we look at the data accumulated from these corals over time, we start to see some pretty clear patterns. The gray bars are the number of treatments per month, and the black bars are the number of diseased corals or the percentage of diseased corals per month. And you can see the cyclical nature to those data. And it turns out that they match the wet and dry season, or the higher temperature seasons over time. And so as summer comes on and temperatures warm up and we start getting a lot of rain, we start seeing a lot more disease. And then as that tapers off, disease tapers off as well. You'll also notice that in 2022 and 2023, we had some of the highest numbers of treatments and diseased corals in the data set. That has to do with those very warm temperatures. So if we did a similar exercise as we did with the water quality, but we look at the disease, number of diseased corals instead, we can actually explain 66% of the variation in the data on just these 6 factors, which includes temperature, water flow in the canals, and rainfall on land. And by far, temperature is the highest explanatory factor, and that's pretty well known. As corals get stressed, they become more vulnerable to disease. But also these water components if they add up to a significant amount as well, and so they shouldn't be discounted as part of the equation. Fun fact: if the corals bleach, the disease actually goes away, because we think it's a disease associated with their symbionts, and when the symbionts are released, the disease stops. Um, but so in order for us to get a better handle on this, we wanted to model the nutrients coming out of the inlets to try to understand and match up, where the water's coming from that's impacting these infected corals. And so we collaborated with a team in Belgium to run these hydrographic models where they estimated the amount of nutrients coming out of the inlets at given times, and then let that run for several years, and then you can estimate the exposure of the reefs for each of those inlets. And when we do that, we can see by far and away that regardless of season, the north side of each inlet receives the majority of the water from that inlet. And some of these can have much farther field effects than others. So you'll see that the red on the left side is the government cut, which is the Port Miami inlet. You'll see that that red extends much further up the coast than some of these other inlets where it might be less. And so with that understanding, we start to get a picture as to what what the main culprit might be. Bear with me on this figure; it's a bit much, but basically, um, the plots on the right are plots of a disease on a coral at a given time. The y-axis goes from 2018 to 2021. And so those are, monthly intervals. And then that's the x-axis. The y-axis is the individual corals, and they're arranged by latitude. So the ones at the top are the most northern corals, and the ones at the bottom are the most further south. But the colors of the dots represent the amount of nitrogen coming from a given inlet. And so you can see that there's 4 plots here, one for each of the inlets, and you can see that the government cut inlet, which is the top left, has the one with the highest darkest dots. So what that's indicating to us is that when the disease occurred on those corals, the majority of the water that coral was exposed to was coming from government cut. So again, a pretty clear indicator that something is going on with the water coming out of government cut. Um, so in a nutshell, we found that the government cut in Baker's Hollow discharged the highest nutrient loads, and that something that should be the target for mitigation or for action. I love these AI slides; they're so much fun, but this one was particularly cool. So to save the reef, you have to fix the bay. That's Biscayne Bay, and in particular, the northern bay is releasing a lot of these water coming out. But mitigating the pollution in Biscayne Bay is the most effective lever we have, because that is contributing the most to the water source that these corals are experiencing offshore. And so we came up with a prescription for recovery. Yeah, I think these are funny. It says fix the plumbing. First, you got to upgrade the infrastructure and government cut and Miami-Dade County to account for, leaking sewage pipes, septic systems, accounting for, polluted runoff, and doing something to filter that before it gets into the waterways. Smart restoration, which would be to, strategically plant your corals away from polluted areas and especially sensitive corals. And then, of course, targeted interventions focused on Biscayne Bay to save the reef outside. Miami-Dade County is doing some of this already. So good news, but it's a massive amount of work. It's going to take probably decades, I think. But they have a program called Connect to Protect, and this program is designed to support and help facilitate people connecting their septic systems to sewer to keep it from continuing to leak into the groundwater and the associated water. They also have a check to protect program, which allows you to check the functionality of your septic system to make sure that it's working properly. They've also taken to creating these fertilizer ordinances. So the map on the right shows areas in municipalities and counties that have a fertilizer ordinance in them and the ones that don't. But Miami-Dade County as a whole adopted these fertilizing bans, and um, they include you cannot fertilize at all during the rainy season, and then a lot of restrictions on what you can fertilize and how much the other times of the year. Interestingly enough, and this is the good news of the talk, is that we think we see maybe an effect from some of these mitigations. You know, these programs have started and ramped up a few years ago. The fertilizer ban went into effect in 2021, and after that period in our data, we see a decrease in the increase of some of these nutrients. So the rate of increase has slowed down, and it could be due to some of these policies that have been put in place recently. So I think this could be an indicator that, you know, action on land can have an effect on what the corals are experiencing in the water. So I'd just like to leave you with a few things. I think this is a fun slide, you know, and it's really, really applicable. Right now, we are at risk of leaving the next generation a world where coral reefs do not exist. And that includes Florida. Florida's reef is struggling, but through management, restoration, and public engagement, recovery is possible. And you can be part of the solution. There are a lot of things that we can do collectively that would help. Obviously, fixing the water problem is beyond one person's thing. But if you're on the water, you can use mooring buoys instead of anchoring on the reefs, or you can obey fishing catch limits to reduce your impact there. At home, you can upgrade your sewage to your septic system to sewage. If you have that problem, you can reduce fertilizer use and other things. Pesticides, the big one. And globally, you can reduce your carbon footprint. You know, I know hopefully you've heard this before, but reducing your carbon footprint can help the global effort. And participate, you know, join citizen science initiatives and get out there and help do some coral restoration. There's some really cool organizations. Rescue a Reef is one that comes to mind at University of Miami that can engage citizens and get them out there doing coral restoration. So with that, I'd just like to not skip over this slide, but acknowledge all of my funders and partners and graduate students. This work that I presented today, it came about literally with, you know, 100 people that helped. And we continue to do great things this coming year. We're expanding our modeling to the whole reef system. So we'll be able to then understand what happens to that water coming out of the Florida Everglades and where it goes and how it affects water quality over time. So with that, I'd say that's it for me.
Well, thank you. I feel like class was in session. That was a very robust presentation. So thank you for all the visuals and all the information. And we do have some time for a few questions. So let's get started with that. If I may ask you the first question, I want to know from where you sit, with all the research that you see, with all the things that you see under the water, are you hopeful or are you pessimistic when it comes to the future of the coral in Florida?
I remain hopeful, hopefully pessimistic. I don't know. Unfortunately, when I started my career, I heard about how great the reef used to be. And then we did a lot of mapping and we found these really cool spots and these really beautiful sites. And thought, I understand the reef used to be better, but it's not. It's really nice. There's some really cool areas. And I showed you some of those today. And then over the course of the last decade, that has changed dramatically. And so is starting to work on coral disease and treating corals and watching a lot of things die. It was a very challenging period for coral reef scientists in Florida, because you're watching your life's work and your efforts just kind of go away. But I think with the support that the governor has put in and other agencies have put into funding research and funding restoration, um, in the region, we can do things smarter now. And, work like this would have never been done in the past. It wouldn't have come out, so we'd still be blind to it. Whereas now we're able to plan around it and start taking action. So I do have hope for the future, and I do think it's worth pursuing.
Let's take a look at some of the questions that were submitted. Marianne T. submitted several excellent questions, so thank you for that. One of the questions she asks is about how long it takes for a reef to recover after a major bleaching event, if it recovers at all.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I didn't have time to go into some of the data that we have on the bleaching, specifically, but a lot of it depends on where it is and the condition of the coral and the length of the bleaching. Um, in 2023, a lot of things died in the Keys. It was too long of a period of bleaching. Whereas up here in Southeast Florida, things did not bleach as much, or perhaps not at all. And one interesting pattern that we found was that corals north of Government Cut, that area that we've been talking about in Port Miami, corals north of there really didn't bleach very much compared to the corals throughout the Keys, and fully recovered from the bleaching over a period of a couple of months, whereas the corals in the Keys took longer to recover, if they recovered at all. Typically, you need 3 to 4 months.
I just saw a question pop in that I think is a really good one from Mary. She's asking, does Broward have a fertilizer ordinance in place? You talked a lot about what Miami-Dade is doing right. How are we doing in Broward County?
We could be doing better, but Fort Lauderdale has an ordinance, which is, a big part of the area around Port Everglades. But the rest of the pretty much the rest of the county doesn't have much. So if you see the map on the right, you'll see that big blue area. That's the city of Fort Lauderdale's ordinance. And I think they adopted pretty much the same ordinance that Miami-Dade County has.
I want to ask a hybrid question, kind of combine two people's questions into one. So I see both Irv and I think it was Heidi who asked about nutrients. You talk about how nutrients are bad for the corals, but when the layman hears about nutrients, they think, oh, nutrients are good. So can you explain why in your world nutrients are bad, and what are the biggest contributors of these nutrients? What kind of things are we talking about here?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Something else I didn't have to get into because it gets very complicated. But so corals corals like nutrient free or very low nutrient water. They get their energy from symbiotic algae inside their tissues, and the algae bring in sunlight and they produce sugars, and the coral uses that, and then the algae gets protection. So um, when you bring in nutrients, and in particular, we're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus because those are typically the biggest nutrients that come from land that can impact water quality. And if you think about a lake, when you have a lot of runoff from the land into the lake, let's say you're fertilizing your yards, you're putting down a lot of extra nitrogen and phosphorus for that grass to really grow. but it doesn't all get taken up. And so when it rains, it washes down into the water, and that water flows into lakes and stuff. Well, lakes and things that have high nutrient, like nitrogen and phosphorus, they explode with macroalgae, right? So you get this big macroalgae bloom because macroalgae thrive off that, and it can outgrow just about anything. And that's what kind of eutrophication is. And you get these macroalgae blooms that then take all the oxygen out of the water, and then you have like a system collapse. So, in our case, a lot of the nutrients that the big ones are nitrogen and phosphorus. Uh, the nitrogen is these are mostly coming from agriculture, particularly the nitrogen. There's a lot of agriculture down in Southwest Miami-Dade, and that flows into Southern Biscayne Bay. Um, and that area is very high in nitrogen. And phosphorus can come from a lot of the fertilizers and stuff. So we see an increase in phosphorus as we go up into the big cities in the northern parts of the bay, and then into Fort Lauderdale as well. And so I'm sorry, it's a very complicated thing. But so not nutrients necessarily aren't bad for corals, but um, an imbalance of nutrients is really what makes it bad for corals. And so if you have the right ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus, you can actually get better growth uh, with higher nutrients. But the problem is that when those become imbalanced, then the symbiotic algae that lives inside the coral gets starved for phosphorus, and then it dies, and then it creates a problem for the corals. You have bleaching. So sorry that hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, I know these are complicated, but we all have a hunger for this information. So thank you for walking us through it. I saw a question from Heidi pop in. She says, many years ago, I had the honor of engaging in coral grafting with NSU from its coral nurseries. She wants to know if this is still a program that's ongoing and are there still opportunities to participate? So do you know about that?
I don't know about NSU's capacity to have just general public volunteers. We do take volunteers to help work in our nursery, but it's a bit of a process to become a volunteer. You have to, be vetted and get approval and have access and all these things. So I don't know if there's any programs that allow diving. I don't think there are any programs that allowed like general public or volunteers to dive with Nova to outplant. And that's why I mentioned the Rescue a Reef program at the University of Miami, because they do have programs like that where you can go out and actually plant corals on the reefs.
Excellent. I'm seeing a lot of people chime in about their interest in doing their part. And you did end on a slide about the different ways that people can, on an individual, make a difference, even though we can feel so hopeless sometimes when we hear about the scope of this problem. What would you say is the most measurable thing that an individual can do? This is a question from Marianne that we can potentially end on.
Well, if I'm honest, I think the most measurable thing is that collectively we let our representatives and political representatives understand and know how important it is to us about this system and about these reefs. Um, I think getting that focus and getting more money and getting the ability to do more has been and would be a game changer compared to the little things that we could do on a regular basis. So if I had to pick one, I'd say that's probably the best one. Let your representatives know how important this is to you.
Thank you. Sarah, do we want to end there?
I think that's a great spot to end. Definitely an important part, like you said, Danielle, what we can do as an individual and where we can come in collectively, whether that's local or government representation. So thank you for a really inspiring and important topic conversation today, Dr. Walker. Being born and raised in South Florida myself, this is an important topic for me. So thank you again for your expertise. Thank you to Danielle for all of your work today and moderating this awesome panel. And thank you to our participants here, our alumni, faculty, staff, friends of NSU. We really look forward to keeping these programs together for you and hosting you next month. So stay tuned. If you have any additional questions for Dr. Walker, we're going to be sending an email from the alumni inbox to you all with a recording of today's presentation, and you can use that survey link that we can help moderate and mediate those conversations to make sure that they're answered timely. So just keep that in mind and keep in touch for the next one. We have our next Lunch and Learn in March, which will focus on long COVID and the effects and what we can do about that. So stay tuned for a sneak peek when we send you this thank you message, and we'll be in touch. So again, thanks to Dr. Walker, thanks to Danielle, and thank you to our incredible alumni. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everybody.